All right. All right. Good evening, everybody. We'll get things started as we get people entered into the webinar. But good evening. My name is Caitlin Swope. I'm the Director of Marketing with the Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative, and we're really excited to bring to you this evening our From Carcass to Consumer Communicating Cuts, Cookery, and Confidence webinar. So this webinar is being brought to you by the Beef Checkoff through the Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative program in partnership with the Pennsylvania Beef Quality Assurance Program, as well as the National Beef Quality Assurance Program through a Northeast grant. So we're excited to bring to you this webinar, which really focuses on how you, as a direct-to-consumer beef producer, can better communicate the various cuts, the cooking methods, to ultimately build confidence among your consumer base and help you to better sell your beef within your local communities. So this evening we're joined by Sierra Anthony of Butcher Solutions and Rob and Amy Hess of Bow Creek Farm. Before we kick things off, just a few ground rules. We want you to ask questions throughout the duration of the webinar. So I'm joined by Hannah Walters, who is the Pennsylvania Beef Quality Assurance State Coordinator. So we'll kind of be co-facilitating this webinar. So please ask your questions using the Q&A feature here within Zoom, and Hannah and I will moderate those and interject as we go through tonight. And then we're going to throw a poll up here. We just want to get an assessment of how many different states we have represented on tonight's webinar. So if you can just answer for us what state you're joining us from, we would greatly appreciate that. And then at the conclusion of the webinar, you'll basically see this information in three different ways, but we have a post-event survey that we'd love for you to complete. Just helps us better serve you in the future in terms of topics and how we can best serve you with these opportunities moving forward. So with that, we'll give you a few more seconds to give us some insight onto what state you're joining us from. But with that, I'll turn it over to Sierra.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caitlin. All righty, everybody. Well, I'm really pleased to be here. I am a former Eastern time zone beef producer. I grew up in the state of Ohio, but I now live in Montana, and I own a traveling butcher school. So I truly travel the country. I train butchers. I teach meat science education, and I can help anybody with their meat speak needs, which does tend to be our beef producers who then are wanting to break into that direct-to-consumer space. And so I'd love to share a little bit about just a bit about not just the beef production, the beef producer side, but also a little bit more about the meat sciencey perspective, especially meat yields and some of these newer cuts that we have out there. So this is my family. They still raise beef cattle in the great state of Ohio. My sister farms full-time with my dad, corn, wheat, soybeans, and then we've got our cattle as well. And so we've got like 60 to 80 mama cows, and then we retain about 25 head of feeder calves, feed those out ourselves, and then we direct market those to consumers. And so even though my dad, my sister, they are the boots on the ground, I manage our freezer beef program all the way from Montana. So even from 2 time zones away, I'm working with our butchers, I'm working with our consumers, pairing up our critters and kind of helping to answer and figure out all of their beefy needs. So that's a fun endeavor. And so you all probably have a lot of questions about, how to answer those consumer questions. And then when it comes down to like the nitty gritty meat science portions. So the number one question that I want to address is, where is the weight going off of our beef carcasses? And this becomes a question that you need to know how to answer, because a consumer always asks, well, how much beef am I going to get? And that's a very tricky question to answer if you haven't thought about where the weight is actually going off of your carcasses. And so let's break down a little bit of meat math here. And let's just pretend that you're at home and you're getting ready to take, a load of steers into your butcher. And let's say a critter weighs about 1,200 pounds at home. Like that's really great to have that as a target weight, but we are immediately going to start taking away some of that weight when we think about transportation loss. So typically, as we are transporting our critters, they're going to lose about 1% per hour. And those first 3 to 4 hours that we're messing with them, they're going to lose that true 1%. It drops off after that. So hopefully, in our Eastern time zone, we aren't shipping cattle, hopefully super long distances. But you do have to think about the time that they are, standing in the pens, or they are, we might be bringing them in from a pasture, and then the time that we're also transporting them. So keep in mind that those critters are losing 1% in the first 3 to 4 hours of transportation. And so even if we weighed them at home, their true live weight, once we get them to the facility and they weigh them live, that's already been reduced by 1% or so. So then we go through our slaughter process, and that's then where we get our hot carcass weight. Once we've removed head, hide, hooves, blood, and guts, then that's what's going to give us the hot carcass weight. Industry average is 63%. This is something that's very, very good for you all to be tracking, especially if you are either harvesting cattle at several different processors, kind of spacing them out to get enough spots, or if you're kind of trying to decide which processor you might want to keep going to. Keeping track of your dressing percentage, just the live weight, or the hot carcass weight, divided by the live weight multiplied by 100. That'll give you that dressing percentage. Should be about 63%. If it's more than that, that's great. They might have a really skilled harvest crew who's keeping everything really clean. They're trimming really closely. They have a scale system. They can weigh those carcasses right when they're leaving the slaughter floor. That'll give you a much higher hot carcass weight, a better dressing percentage, and you're getting paid on that. Versus if that dressing percentage is really low, maybe there was an abscess that busted. Maybe the crew is really green and they're leaving a lot of meat and fat on the hide. And so just something to monitor and keep an eye on. So you want a good dressing percentage, and help consumers remember that they're purchasing cattle on that hot carcass weight. And so, it might be 753-pound carcass that then they're going to be paying $3.50 per pound, or $4 or $6, whatever you're charging. And so that's what they're being charged for. However, they are not receiving 753 pounds of beef. That's where we get a lot of these questions. It's like, okay, well, where is it going? So once that critter leaves the harvest floor, it's going to the cooler. Beef critters, we recommend they hang for a week to 2 weeks. Any more than that, and you're just going to continue to lose evaporative loss. This is truly just money leaving the carcass into thin air. Our beef carcasses are made up of 75% water, and so that average evaporative loss is going to be 1 to 3%, and that's an industry average. And so with our smaller mom and pop shops that don't have spray chilling, that might kind of have some outdated cooling systems, that might have really packed coolers, that loss could be anywhere from 5 to 7%. And so you're going to lose 23 to 40 pounds of meat just in evaporative loss. And so, yes, being able to hang those carcasses for about a week is great for aging and allowing that enzymatic activity to break down tissue and to age those carcasses. That's good. But we don't want those carcasses hanging for a really, really long time. We do want to have some fat coverage on there to retain moisture, or else you're truly just losing a lot of evaporative loss off those carcasses. Okay, so then truly we've got 730 pounds to play with then once it actually hits the fabrication floor. And so kidney, pelvic, heart fat, that is what's surrounding our internal organs, about 3% of the carcass. Unless you're rendering fat for soaps or lotions, that fat is good for rendering. It's not really good for anything else. If you're making your own biofuels, feel free to save your kidney, pelvic, heart fat. And then you're also going to have bone and subcutaneous trimmable fat that you're going to remove from there as well. It's like about 200 pounds. We did get a question in the pre-survey about trimmable fat and things like that, and the differences in yield between grass finished and grain finished. You've got to think that some of your grass finished animals might not have as much of that trimmable fat to give up. However, those animals might have more evaporative loss because they didn't have that fat to retain moisture. So there's a little bit of give and take there. So overall total for this critter that came in, it was 1,200 pound animal, 750 hot carcass weight. You're going to yield about 500 pounds of closely trimmed retail cuts, steaks and roasts, but also the ground beef. So how do you actually communicate that to a consumer? You know, this is the math that shows where it actually went. But what you want to actually tell a consumer is you're going to receive about 2/3 of the hot carcass weight, being what you paid for. However, there's going to be a little bit of fat and bone waste that we remove from there. For you as the livestock producer, if you like thinking more in terms of the hot carcass weight side of things, you can do your calculations every time you weigh a live animal. You can do the calculation of 42% of that live weight is going to be the saleable product. So 2 different ways to think of it. As I'm going through this presentation, feel free to be asking questions in the Q&A. I know this is just, drinking through a water hose or a fire hose, excuse me. So feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and Caitlin and Hannah will both be able to help field those questions either as we go or at the end.
Yeah, we actually had one come in, Sierra.
Okay.
We have Arthur Fuller asking, would you agree that the loss of weight during hang time increases the flavor?
Loss of weight, not necessarily. Not necessarily, because fat is flavor, and so we are not actually evaporating any fat. We're just kind of losing some water. I don't think we're really like concentrating any muscles or anything there. Yeah, fat is flavor, so we're not losing fat. We're just losing water. But that's a good thought. Okay, so thinking along the lines, again, of how do we answer this question to consumers? How much will I get? Another good thing for you to track is the average hot carcass weights of your critters, because it helps you answer that question in the future. Because we don't really know how much a person is going to get. We have, 25, 30, 50 critters that we could sell to any of them. We can't give them an actual number. So keeping a track of hot carcass weight averages is a good way to give people a ballpark. Last year, our average hot carcass weight was 753 pounds. You can get about 2/3, you can expect to get about 2/3 of that back. And then you can help them do some meat math of, we charge $3.50 per pound, or we charge $6 per pound of that hot carcass weight. And so then you can help them figure out, how much products they might be getting, how much per pound they might be paying, and kind of help them work backwards from there. From there, you can also help them figure out a whole critter. You're going to be getting, 2/3 of that would be about 500 pounds, half would be about 250, a quarter would be about 125. That'll help people visualize how much product they get. And then also a question we get, how much freezer space do I need? Most commonly, this is for folks that have never had beef before. Typically, if they're getting a whole, you want them to have over a 17-foot cubic freezer. Just, give us the whole thing. Typically, a half, you might need that 8 to 10 cubic foot space, a quarter, 5 to 7 foot cubic space. So that it's a good ballpark, but help people realize that you might want a freezer specifically designated for just your meat, especially if you're getting a whole or a half. Okay, so let's dive into some of the cuts here. Some of the biggest misconceptions that we get from our consumers is not truly understanding how much of the carcass is locomotive, meaning those would be the steaks and the roasts that we would want to use a low, slow, moist heat, not necessarily a grilling dry heat. And so thinking about 29% of the carcass is coming from the chuck, 22% is coming from the round. That's a big portion of our carcass that is locomotive, that requires a crock pot or a little bit more slow cooking. We've got the brisket thrown in, shanks, the short plate, which would all require a little bit more low, slow cooking styles. And only 11% given to the rib, and 22%, 27%, somewhere in that range for that loin and that sirloin. And that statistics tends to waver because we are making our carcasses longer as we breed them. That's a fun statistic we can talk about later. Anyway, so helping our consumers recognize that you aren't going to get all middle meats out of your carcasses. We do have to figure out how to use roasts and how to use grinds. And so when somebody wants the whole thing to be made up of tenderloin, that's just not possible. So we are going to roll through just very quickly some of the common cuts that our custom cutting cut sheets tend to feature. So thinking of the chuck, again, about like 29% of the carcass is made up in the chuck. That's a lot of weight. So we do have a lot of ground that comes out of the chuck. We do have some stew meat that comes out of there. Most commonly on your custom cut sheets for freezer beef, you're going to be given 2 or 3 options, and they're typically going to be the roasts, an arm roast or a blade roast. These are very easy for our butchers to cut across a bandsaw. They can move very, very quickly, and it doesn't require them to really do anything skillful with the chuck. And so most of the time, you're going to be getting roasts out of the chuck. Now, if you have a very innovative butcher, they might give you the option for a boneless style chuck. That is where we've got our Delmonico steaks, our flat irons, our Terrace Major, the mock tender. There are some pretty good steakable items that can come from the chuck, but it requires much, much more skill from those butchers to actually bone out these chucks. And it takes a lot of time. And so if they're offering you a boneless chuck option, or even some of these steaks, somebody is going to be paying for it. That might be the consumer. They might charge them, extra, or ask for an extra cutting fee for that option. So more than likely, they won't just advertise that they have a boneless option unless those steaks are specifically asked for. Now, some of you did ask the question about the Delmonico steak and what is the difference between a ribeye and a Delmonico, and how do I actually explain it? So you can see here that the chuck and the rib sit right next to each other. They are next door neighbors. When we make that break, ribeye steaks come from the rib, and then the Delmonico steak comes from the chuck side. And so a Delmonico and a ribeye share the exact same set of muscles. Okay, so the exact same set of muscles, so they look very similar. However, the Delmonico is not worth as much money because it is on that chuck side, and so that steak is a little bit more locomotive. Those muscles had to do a little bit more walking, and so they're slightly more tough. Also, those muscles, they start in the chuck and then they get bigger the further back they go. And so those muscles are a little bit smaller. So the Delmonico is a fancy way of saying it's a ribeye, but from the chuck side. I think they call it the poor man's ribeye because it's on the chuck break. So perfectly acceptable to sell. You get 2 of those per side of the carcass, so 4 total. So not very many, and consumers should not pay more for a Delmonico than they do for the ribeye, because again, the ribeye is the more tender, more support muscle, not necessarily locomotive. And if you have more questions about all these innovative cuts, we can talk more about those later. Okay, so then the brisket and the shank portions, also up in our forequarter, 2 tougher cuts. Sometimes consumers choose not to keep these. Sometimes they want to grind them, which in Texas and out west, people would find that sacrilegious that somebody wants to grind the brisket, but you can if you want. It's your meat, you bought it. This might be something that you want to work out with your butcher anytime. If somebody says that they want to grind the brisket, maybe you work out with them that, hey, butcher, you can purchase the brisket from me and then supplement extra ground beef or something. Ask them if that's okay if they buy the brisket from you, just so then your butcher may want to put that in their meat case. So something to consider. Crosscut shanks are really delightful for people who like bone marrow, and a lot of times, sometimes crosscut shanks or ossobuco don't show up on those cut sheets, and so this is a great option again to offer up or to recommend as one of those like secret cuts that might exist. All right, moving forward, the rib. Everybody's favorite primal. Everybody knows a ribeye steak. So when we think about how many ribeye steaks or rib steaks that we're going to get off the carcass, typically 20 to 26 for the whole carcass, depending on how thick you cut them. I do want to bring up that a boneless, excuse me, Yes, a bone-in ribeye does not exist. A bone-in ribeye does not exist. You either have a rib steak that has a rib, or you have a ribeye. So that's just something fun that our menus don't always get correct. So this is where if people choose that they want to have bones left in, they need to coordinate with the other person who's getting the other half of the quarter with them, that they might not get the cutting instructions that they want if somebody wants bone in and somebody else wants boneless, because once we remove those back ribs, you can't put that rib back in. So just one of those little cutting niches that we have to consider when we're pairing people up for their cutting instructions. And so that's where offering people a bone-in or a boneless option, or even just or asking them, it's like, do you typically like your steaks boneless or bone-in when you get your cutting instructions? That might help you pair people together really well. The plate, the plate, trash, garbage. There we go. The plate actually is an area that tends to end up in grind. My dad thinks of short ribs kind of like seafood. It's a lot of work for not a lot of meat. And so when you look at this whole plate subprimal up here, the first 3 ribs are actually the only portion of that that actually becomes the short ribs. You can tell that that muscle really tapers off and becomes fatty. And so there's not a whole lot there. So if you choose to sell short ribs, that's wonderful. Consumers can ask for them, but there aren't going to be a whole lot of product. They might get a couple of pounds of them, but there's not a whole lot that goes into the plate. A lot of that's grind. And then,
Sarah,
oh, yes.
just wanted to pop on. We did have a couple quick questions about the last slide.
Okay.
We do have one that she was wondering. She gets a lot of boneless options from her processor, and when they ask for a boneless ribeye, it comes back labeled a Delmonico. So she was wondering what the discrepancy there would be.
That's interesting. That must just be butcher misinformation.
Can I butt
Sometimes,
in?
sure.
Hey, so there are a lot of butchers in our area that the ribeye and the Delmonico are the same cut. That the steaks from the chuck are chuck eye.
So a chuck eye steak is a Delmonico, or excuse me, a Delmonico is a chuck eye steak, but a chuck eye is not always a Delmonico.
No, Delmonico and ribeye are the same thing.
No, you're not saying they are the same. It's just that butchers
No,
in
the
our
butchers
geographic
here
area
in our
do that.
area call them the same thing. It's an either or.
Well, that's
Yeah.
butcher misinformation. So like
Yes,
the
yeah.
correct-
So it's one of those different
Yeah.
part of the country thing that ribeye and Delmonico are the same here, and then the chuck eye would be the steak from the chuck.
That's fine. I'm
That's-
going to
that's
be
the thing.
sharing NCBA national labeling standards that we're trying to really encourage butchers to enforce, because a lot of words do get thrown around and they're not necessarily correct all of the time. And so I'm sharing the correct form of what a Delmonico is truly, it is only the first 2 steaks off of the chuck side. That would be chuck eye steaks, technically. It's like a grizzly bear is a brown bear. Anyway. So a chuck eye steak, the first 2 could be considered Delmonicos. Because they have the same muscles, a lot of people think that they can continue calling them the ribeyes Delmonico steaks. It's not true. Regionally, butchers tend to do whatever they want. So I'm here to share what those things are. If your consumers recognize them in the area, okay. But I'm just trying to help here. That ribeye would be the more correct terminology for it. Okay. When it comes to our skirt steaks, this is another one that tends, we've got inside skirt, outside skirts, and then we've got another cut later on that tend to kind of get thrown into the skirt category. Those muscles are along our abdominal walls, and so you really only get one. You get one per side. And so there, if you're splitting into quarters, not everybody's going to get one. And so you might have to do a little bit of wheeling and dealing. Some cut sheets don't even have skirt steak on their cut lists because sometimes they get ruined in the evisceration process. And so sometimes you have to ask for those. So something to always keep in mind because they are tender, awesome pieces of meat. Same thing with the flanks. You only get one per side. And so quarters, not everybody's going to get a flank, but if you do halves and wholes, you might get a flank if you're lucky. All right, and then moving back into some more of our middle meats. So our loin, or more specifically the short loin here, this is one where consumers tend to, this is where the boneless or the bone-in option is really important for people to understand, because if you have bone-in, then you get either T-bones and porterhouses, or if you get boneless, then you get tenderloin fillets and New York strips. You cannot get T-bones, porterhouses, and still have fillets because you have to have all of those muscles to make up T-bones and porterhouses. The difference between a T-bone and a porterhouse, a T-bone has less than 1.25 inches of that tenderloin muscle, and then a porterhouse has greater than 1.25 inches. And so that's why you tend to pay a little bit more for that porterhouse, is because you're paying for more tenderloin in there. We did have a question that came through of somebody had purchased, eaten their own beef. They were the New York strips, and they were disappointed that they were a little bit tough. Why is that? So a couple of things. So if we look up here at our porterhouse, as those cuts go further back into the round, there is some of our gluteus medius muscle that sneaks in. That's a little bit of the sirloin. And so that sirloin can add kind of like a vein connection. Those are called our vein steaks. Those can make a tougher eating experience. And then also we have to think that our animals put on fat from the front to the back. And so the front steaks and roasts have much, much more fat interwoven in between the muscle bundles and more marbling within the steaks. And so the further back they go into our loin, the less marbling that we might have. And so those strip loins are not going to have as much of an insurance policy as what our ribeyes would be. So it's not necessarily that you had bad beef or anything like that. There's probably just either, depending on how locomotive or how far back that strip steak was, you could have had a tougher eating experience just from the physiological standpoint. And then let's see, when it comes to those fillets and the New York strips, typically you're only going to get like 6 to 8 fillets for the whole carcass, just because, depending on the thickness that you get them cut. So as much as we want the whole carcass to be tenderloin, it just doesn't work that way. Our sirloin is one of the cuts that this tends to be, this was what my meat science research was on. This tends to be the cut that varies, is the most variable in terms of tenderness and cutting style. Typically when we're getting custom freezer beef orders, we're going to see sirloin steaks come out like this image here on the left, where they are large multi-muscle steaks. They are about the size of a 9x13 baking dish. They're going to be really, really huge. And so if you know that that's what your butcher is offering, you might want to ask those to be cut like 1 inch thick. What I'm trying to encourage butchers to do would be take apart the individual muscles, and then that's when you get your culottes, your picanhas, top sirloin cap. All of those are synonyms. You can get your baseball steaks, and you can do a little bit more portion-sized cuts. However, typically on a cut sheet, a lot of our custom cuts are not going to turn out looking that way. And so that will kind of depend on how many steaks your consumers can get. So the top sirloin does come from the more of the back region, or up closer towards the spine of the animal. And then the bottom sirloin, that's where our tri-tip, our ball tip, and our sirloin flap sits. So the tri-tip, we did get a question on what is that? Where does it sit? It kind of sits in that flank stifle area. And so it is a very locomotive muscle. It has a lot of really good beefy flavor. And it is one of those that you wanna roast it on more of a dry heat, not crock pot it, but it is more of a, put it on the grill with indirect heat, use a rub, and then slice it later. And that muscle can be really, really great. That originated, California, that is their staple, and it's slowly making its way across the country. I think it's like stuck somewhere in like Missouri right now. So if your region knows about the tri-tip and is taking advantage of it, that is wonderful. Okie dokie. And then finally, moving here into, whoops, not that one quite yet, into our round. So the round is top round, bottom round, eye round, and the knuckle. Most of these large, lean, locomotive pieces of meat, most of these become our roasts. They might become ground beef. Somebody asked the question about the Western griller. That is a steak from the bottom round. So we continue to try to find ways to turn more of these roasting items into grillable items. And so the Western griller, there's a couple that came out of the top round as well. London broil tends to come from the top round. London broil is a cooking style, not necessarily a cut of meat. It just means large, lean piece of meat that can be marinated. Typically, those are our top rounds that get cut into London broils. So plenty of good steaks can come from the top rounds and the bottom rounds if you send them through a cuber or you cut them very thin. Otherwise, roasting are great options for these. Okay, and so as we communicate all of these cuts with our consumers, one of the best things that you all can do is obtain the beef cuts chart and either send these out to some of your customers, either your newer customers, and then pair that up with the cut sheet that your butcher offers, and maybe like circle some of the cuts that are on the cut sheet so then they can actually see what they might look like or what they're supposed to look like, and kind of match up. Even if it's like, okay, we use the word Delmonico, that's actually over here, it's going to look like what these ribeyes look like. So you can kind of match those up. Or if you're trying out a new butcher and you're not quite sure of what kind of cuts that they do offer, especially if your consumers know a little bit more than the lay consumer, and they might know what a tri-tip is, or they want to request the flank steak or a skirt steak. You could talk to your butcher and say, okay, we know that your typical cut sheet is X, Y, and Z. What other cuts might you all be willing to provide if somebody specifically requests it? And then they might look at the cut chart and be able to say, oh yes, we can do a flat iron, but only if somebody asks. Those are little things that then you can provide information to your customers that people might be really interested in, of like, the secret menu, that they're not going to offer it because they can cut faster if they don't offer those steaks. However, these are things that they would put in a retail case and that they do know how to cut and they can provide later. Helping people know the differences in fat is really important because typically if you ask somebody, get some feedback of how was your beef last year, and they say, oh, it was a little fatty. You need to know, tell me more. Tell me more, like what kind of the fat didn't you care for? Because they might not understand the benefits of marbling and the tenderness, the juiciness, the palatability illusion that it provides. And so helping folks understand that marbling is an insurance policy. So whether you like your steak cooked medium rare or well done, the more marbling you have, the higher tolerance to that high cooking heats you will have. Perhaps they might be seeking more lean meats, and so recommending a steer rather than a heifer could be helpful. If you have a critter that is a little bit less finished, you might be able to recommend to those folks, or you could offer up like a hind quarter bundle. Again, our critters put on fat from the front to the back, and so marketing them, the loin, the sirloin, and the round might be more desirable than chuck roasts and ribeye steaks. And then you could always recommend to have a tighter trimming spec from your butcher, just meaning that they're leaving less of that external subcutaneous fat. That's something a consumer can always request. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to touch on is packaging type. This tends to be a question consumers ask, is vacuum sealing or butcher paper better? The answer is it depends. They both have pros and cons. If people don't have a lot of space in their freezer, typically that butcher paper does stack much easier, and so they're going to have a nicer time making everything fit. And you can, defrost it in the microwave. Some folks prefer that. I like vacuum sealing because I thaw in cold running water, and so that's my favorite way to thaw meat, and so that's why I prefer vacuum sealing. You can also see the meat product. People get excited when they can tell how many steaks are in there, what it looks like. They typically have a little bit longer shelf life because of the air blocking barrier, but the butcher paper tends to not have an extra cost. So either way, pros and cons, but two very good options for people to consider. Okay, I know that this was a lot of information, but if you have any questions, we can run through those now. And then here are some additional resources from universities that have put out quite a bit of science and research on the yields of our meat carcasses, or our beef carcasses specifically. I would encourage, if you are Googling any information about freezer beef yields, try to go through a university. There are some several misinformations about yields that might not necessarily be true out there. So plenty of good university resources for you all to check out. They've done the research.
Yeah, I think before we turn it over to Rob and Amy, Sierra, there's a few questions that probably make sense just to touch on now. So we got a question: if butchers are getting you a hanging weight right before cutting after aging, are you technically losing money due to them not being weighed right after they're killed?
Yes, and that was something that we were working with our butcher in Ohio. They weren't weighing the carcasses until several days later, which is fine. They weren't weighing them until they rolled out, and so that was unfortunate that you are losing money. And so if there are any grant monies or resources you could send their way to help your butcher buy a scale to weigh carcasses right before they go into the carcass weight, that will save you money. If you're shopping around for a new butcher, that is a good question to ask: is when do you take the hot carcass weight? Because it is your bottom line. If they weigh the carcass before it goes into the chilling cooler, you as the producer do make more money.
Nope, that's good feedback. Then another question related to kind of cut names: prime rib roast versus standing rib roast. And this producer shared, just because my beef is over 30 months, why do I need to change the name of the roast?
Good question. So prime rib, standing rib, same thing. Standing rib is referring to the ribs still being attached. So if it's over 30 months, they need to chine that beef carcass and take off the backbone and make sure that there's no vertebral column connected, because that's a BSE concern. And so they might be removing those back ribs and then tying them back on. Or they might not be able to, due to USDA, they might not be able to have any of that backbone or any of the rib bones. So I would have to, ribeye roast is completely boneless. Standing rib roast and prime rib roast, I believe, are the same thing, but I would double check on that. But it's definitely more so, standing rib roast, it's definitely not chined.
Perfect.
So,
and then tying off of that, the same producer asked, will the USDA consider allowing beef over 30 months to be cut into prime cuts?
Yes, they just cannot. You will not be able to get T-bones and porterhouses from beef over 30 months. Again, for the same thing, you can't have that vertebral column, and so that T-bone is the vertebral column. So you can still get briskets, you can get your chuck roasts, you can get your ribeye steaks, you can get tenderloins and New York strips, but you cannot get porterhouses and T-bones. That's pretty much the only difference.
Perfect. And then two final questions before we pass it over to Rob and Amy. But we have a question: do you work within your business mostly with custom or USDA butchers?
Both. Truly anybody who needs butcher education. Mm-hmm.
And then we have one other question. The presentation you shared, is that something you'd be willing to share with attendees?
Yep, absolutely. And I can, I guess, Caitlin, you've got access to that. So.
Yep. Perfect. That's all we have.
Great. Thank you. All right, Rob and Amy, you guys are up.
Thanks, Sierra. Hi, I'm Amy Hess, and I'm here with my husband, Rob. We are beef producers from Hershey, Pennsylvania, and we own and operate Boat Creek Farm. Our farm, we have a shop on our farm where we retail beef, and we also sell wholesale to different restaurants and institutions. Just to give you a little idea of our background, we are both first-generation farmers, ranchers. When we got married, excuse me, in 1998, Rob was finishing, he might have had like 3 or 4 head that he was finishing for beef. So over the years, we slowly got more involved with cattle. In 2004, we purchased our first Red Angus animals and decided to breed registered animals at the time, just cow-calf operation, seed stock. Then in 2012, we started selling beef to the Hotel Hershey in Hershey, and just really close to our house. It's quite a big hotel. They have 3 different restaurants at the hotel. And really at the time, like I said, we had just been doing cow-calf, weren't selling beef at all. I walk into my husband's office one day. He's typing up a letter, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm writing a letter to the chef at the hotel and saying, we're local ranchers. If you'd ever be interested in beef, we'd like to talk to you." Well, I was like, "Okay, well, we don't do that." He's like, "Well, we could." So lo and behold, the chef called us back. We had a meeting with him. He wanted to try our beef, so we went home and we started raising beef animals. Over that time, for the next 6 or 7 years, they were our only customer. We had been selling them, 4 or 5 animals per month?
It was 36 animals a year.
Yeah, 36 animals a year, and that was all we were doing for quite a long time. We would sell some shares from time to time. And really our experience selling shares, I would say if your butcher will cut eighths, that was very helpful to us. We had a hard time in our area selling quarters and halves. And we were lucky that our butcher would do that for us. That was a big deal. Also, it was really important that we were able to sell mixed shares. I know with some of the butchers, that's not a possibility, but if you can get your butcher to mix the share, that was really helpful, because customers really had a hard time understanding that they couldn't get certain cuts from certain areas. Can you think of anything else that was?
I think that we were very fortunate that our first customer was culinary professionals, that we had to learn a lot from them, and we learned a lot about the meat before we interacted with a lot of consumers. So we were well prepared to deal with consumers because we were forced to better understand the entire animal through our experience with culinary professionals before we entered the retail market. So in 2018 was when we decided to enter the retail market, and we really did that to diversify because from 2012 to 2018, 100% of our sales was to one facility. So the other aspect that we were beneficial from was we had to establish a schedule. Deviating from that schedule with our butcher was not an option, or deviating from the schedule with our customer wasn't an option either. We knew that every month we had to provide 4 to 6 animals per month, and it was non-negotiable. So those animals went to the butcher. It made it easy for the butcher to depend on us, and likewise, it kept us focused in knowing we were fortunate to have a customer that demanded that product each month, and it forced us to maintain that schedule with the butcher. Because I think a lot of times you're in a relationship where you need to maintain a healthy relationship with that butcher, and if you don't deliver the animals to them, it makes them hard to operate their business. So we were fortunate that we had that established schedule. But in 2018, we decided we wanted to diversify. So that's when we built an on-farm store, and we also purchased a walk-in freezer. So what that allowed us, where that benefited us was having that walk-in freezer allowed us to maintain an inventory. And it enabled us to connect with 3 or 4 other restaurants that we hadn't worked with in the past. And again, I know we're very fortunate or unfortunate, right? We're in a geographic area where we have good restaurants and tourists, and we are able to service that. Geographically, if we were in the middle of nowhere, we'd certainly have to take a different approach. But in 2018, when we built that store and we bought the walk-in freezer, we maintained that consistent schedule with the butcher. We added like 2 animals a month to that schedule, and then that enabled us to reach consumers. But from 2018 until COVID, quite honestly, our sales at our on-farm store were still only 25% of our sales. Now, we were very fortunate that in January of 2020, we started an online store where we were able to take orders online and ship online. And obviously, that was very timely because it was only 3 months before COVID, and we were very well prepared. And when the restaurants closed, we were fortunate enough to be able to redirect those animals that would have went to restaurants and just have them cut for retail. So it was a series of fortunate events that we just took steps that enabled us to grow organically, having that product available. But again, I know we're in a geographic area where it's a lot different than some people, and if quarters and halves might be the best option, because I will say that with our business, it is an awful lot of time and inventory. It's very difficult to maintain that inventory. It's not a lot of overhead because we do it all ourselves. The unfortunate thing is we're tied to it a lot. So I think you might have a lot more flexibility with shares if you're able to do it that way.
Yeah, and as Sierra was talking about, is getting your butcher to cut some of those things like the flat iron, the tri-tip, the culotte, and educating your customers about what those cuts are if your butcher will cut them. It just it gives them a better eating experience with more steaks to cook with, because everybody wants as many steaks in their share as they can possibly get. So if you if you can get your butchers to cut those, I would definitely work on making sure your customers are ordering those.
Caitlin, is there any questions at this point?
Oh, hey guys, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Awesome. So we do have one question. They were curious about pricing. So how do you ensure that you are still able to get a good price as the market price continues to increase? And how do you handle setting your pricing structure to match that of the market price?
So with some of our food service customers, we have a predetermined price for an entire animal. And then with other food service customers, we're very fortunate that they are taking a lot of the components that we can't sell enough at our retail store. But to be completely honest, we are not raising our prices rapidly enough. We are raising approximately half the calves we need each year and then purchasing half the calves from a couple local producers that have red Angus bulls. And we are dropping the ball. We need to raise our prices faster. Obviously, our input cost on the animals that we're purchasing is up over 100% in 5 years. So it's unfortunate, but being only 2 of us, it's one of those things that we should react quicker to it, and we haven't done a good enough job doing that.
Yeah, and I will say that a lot of customers might come to you for a share or might come to our shop thinking that they're going to get a better deal than the grocery store. And honestly, there's just no way to sell beef for cheaper than the grocery store. I mean, if your price needs to be higher than that for a comparable product. I mean, it's just one of those things that you have to really take a serious look at and make sure, because you might be thinking, oh, well, I covered the feed costs, I covered the butchering costs, but were you covering your time? Were you covering your gas? If you are storing the beef at all, I mean, you have to cover all of those other overhead costs and make sure that you're paying yourself for your time. I mean, I know a lot of people do this for a hobby. And I'm not going to say that our beef business pays all of our bills either. We do depend on outside income as well. But you really have to make sure you're charging enough for your product. And I always kind of joke about it, but like, charge the highest price you can absolutely get.
We did have another question on explaining and expanding how your shipping of your beef works.
So about 50 miles east of us is the Joe Jerglowitz Duck Company. It's near Hamburg, Pennsylvania. His neighbor actually graduated from Penn State with a degree in thermodynamics or something like that. He had developed a cooler system. I will think of the name of the company and we'll tell everybody then. We purchased coolers from him where it's a kit, and you'll buy like a hypothetically a 20 by 12 by 12 box with the styrofoam insulation that goes in it. And that kit is somewhere in the area of $12 to $14 and probably can hold, depending on the cuts, maybe 10 to 15 pounds of meat, depending on cuts and time of the year. But that company also sells ice blankets that are dehydrated. You hydrate them, you freeze them, and then you encapsulate the meat in that cooler to ship it. All of that said, I would be very cautious about shipping meat, only because you need to remember, if somebody orders, like if you go on our website and you order $200 worth of meat, it's going to take at minimum 1 hour labor to package that meat in a box that costs you $15 to $16 with the ice. And then you're going to have to take it to a UPS store. So the cost of shipping and managing that inventory is very difficult. Now, again, geographically, if you're not close enough to consumers, maybe that's something you have to do. But for Amy and I, we know that we're better off to sell to food service and sell through our retail store. The shipping, we can't charge enough to make it worthwhile to do it.
Yeah, and going back to selling shares and or even just selling cuts in our store, I mean, we have to sell every cut in the animal. So, and that can get really difficult. We have a lot of customers in our area that come in our store and they do not eat ground beef. They only eat steaks. For a long time, we had a hard time getting rid of ground beef, finding a home for it. That's why it was so important for us to have the restaurant customers that we do. But again, it's really important to educate your customers about different cuts. Some ways that we've done that in the past is to use social media, post different recipes. Whenever we have a cut that we're having build up and Rob can't sell, he always likes to throw it on the grill and videotape it landing on the grill. That always seems to have people ask about it. Can you think of any other things you've done? We've worked with different influencers before. If you know anyone in your local area who has a good following. Did you have something else to say? Mm-mm. So I think it's really important, like I said, to help your customers cook and have the best eating experience they can. One thing that Rob always likes to talk about is he always asks them how you're going to cook this. Are you going to use a gas grill? Are you going to put it in a cast iron pan? He likes to promote. You want to talk about what you like to promote?
Well, I guess I was kind of going to get into that. It's charcoal grills are way more forgiving than gas, right? Everybody could screw up a steak on a gas grill because it flares up, it scorches it, and it does damage. But so I think a lot of times if you have a tough steak, maybe it wasn't a tough steak, maybe it was the cooking method. So we do talk to people about cooking methods a lot. And I think that also leads into, do you like it lean or do you like something well marbled? Because we probably have an equal number of customers who like lean cuts as well marbled. Our ribeyes sell out on a weekly basis, but so do a lot of leaner cuts. Like if we talk about the Terrace Major, the petite tender, they're very popular. I know that the strip isn't labeled as lean, but we have a certain set of customers that only want strip and they don't want the fat in that ribeye. Other things that we've done is like we do obviously a lot of continuing education, but cuts that we didn't even know about 5 years ago, the bavette or the bottom sirloin flap, we sell out of all the time because our customers now know about that. But again, we're not selling shares, so it's a little bit different. We have to have the knowledge to move those cuts through our shop.
Yeah. And if you are selling cuts and you're having trouble moving some of them, like the bottom round, eye rows, those are always things that are more difficult for us to move. You might want to look at selling bundles where those cuts would be included with some of the more desirable cuts, and you can move them that way. We don't really feel the need to do that. We haven't had that problem again, and some of that is taken care of by our restaurant and wholesale business. Some other ways, like I said, we used to have a harder time selling ground beef in our retail store. We've worked with our butcher to come up with some value added items like sausages. If your butcher does beef sticks or jerky, we're pretty lucky in our area. We have a really great butcher that does some extra things. We do a bunch of heat need items like sloppy joe, pulled beef, and chili as well. So if you can convince your butcher to make some of those items, that's always a big help in getting rid of some of those cuts that are less desirable. So is there any questions or?
We do. We have one question here about your usage of the word share instead of half or a quarter. And they were wondering if that terminology, if you're using that intentionally and if it makes it easier to market your beef.
Yeah, so we believe, since we do everything we process is USDA inspected, because currently about 52% of our product is retail, 48% is food service. So we do everything USDA inspected, and Amy does the instructions for every animal, and we don't give the customer the option to cut things custom, except occasionally we'll do something like a whole plate rib for somebody or something like that if they want to smoke it. But what we have found is having that relationship with our butcher makes things much more seamless. And we go in, Amy does the instructions online, submits them to the butcher. The consumer never has an option to communicate with the butcher, nor does the consumer ever go to our butcher and pick it up. So we are 100% responsible to get that animal to the butcher and to get that meat home and to pay the bill to the butcher. So we do that because we want to maintain the healthiest possible relationship with the butcher. So the reason we use the term share is we construct like a 100-pound bundle, but we do not sell quarters or halves.
Yeah, and I think the other reason too that I always say share is because we were selling eighths, a lot of eighths. It was very infrequent that someone wanted like a quarter or a half. So I think that's just why I say share, because it was what we used to do. But any other questions?
I think we are at our end of time here. So if anybody has any other questions, they can feel free to email us. But I wanted to thank everybody for joining us tonight. A big thank you to Rob and Amy Hess, as well as Sierra Anthony, for their great insights this evening. I think they provided us with a lot of great details, and I know I was taking some notes along the way, so hope you all were. But if you need to access this, we actually did record it this evening, so we will be sending a follow-up email with several different resources, including those cut charts and how to access some of that educational material, a survey, and some more information to follow in that email within the next 24 hours. Also, just wanted to give a shout out next week on September 25th from 7 to 8 p.m. Same day and same place. We will be hosting a webinar for the Asian longhorn tick. So if you don't know about that, feel free to join in. And if you have been experiencing that, we have some great professionals there to kind of talk us through what's been going on with that little pest. So with that, from NEBPI, BQA, PABQA, Rob and Amy, and Sierra, we thank you, and as well as Caitlin. Have a great night.